Alright, I think we are on. So, this is going to be a video on my casting process for silicone mold using epoxy resins. So, yeah, let's take a quick look. I'll be casting one of these guys. So, it's a Gorgon fridge magnet that I sculpted out of traditional clay, and this is one of the first casts that I pulled out. You may have seen that on Patreon already, and I'm gonna do another one today, so I thought I will record a video. So this is the silicone mold that I made for the sculpture, and it's just a simple one-piece open top platinum silicone mold. And yeah, I think next time I do another mold, I will record a similar video. So this is the first one, and we'll see how it goes. But yeah, basically this is the mold, and I'll show you the other products that I will be using. So we've got wooden popsicle sticks, nice and cheap, and yeah, handy for mixing stuff. You'll go through a fair bit of these, so just grab them from eBay. Paper towels, need plenty of these. Of course, I'm wearing gloves. This one has a rip in it, but that's alright. Yeah, gloves, you need gloves. And the epoxy resin that I'm using is from Barnes, and it's called Ultra Pour. So this is epoxy, this is not polyurethane, and the big difference between polyurethane and epoxy resin is the cure time and the working time. So typically with epoxy resins like this, you have about a 2-hour working time and a 24 to 48 hour curing time. So from the time you pour to the time you're able to take the cured hardened resin out of the mold is around, yeah, can be around 30 hours. So that may seem like a long time, and epoxy resin is generally designed to be used for art making. So you see people doing resin art and stuff like that. So they're designed to be really slow curings to allow you time to, you know, mix colors and pour it and you know, make designs out of the resin. So the reason why I'm choosing to use epoxy resin for creating casts is because of the price of the epoxy resin. So typically they are about $10 to $20 cheaper than polyurethane. And the other difference, polyurethane, you generally have a working time of around 20 minutes to 15 minutes, and some resins is like 5 minutes. So you really have to work fast when you're using polyurethane resin. And I don't like to work fast. I've used polyurethane plenty in the past, and I always end up, you know, running out of time, and you know, I've had a few instances where I've had like 500 mils of polyurethane resin just cured in the cup. So that was a waste. So I like to take my time, but you know, when you have your process down and when you need to make small parts like this, yeah, polyurethane might be a better choice. Like, you know, polyurethane resin usually takes about 2 hours or an hour before you can pour the piece out of the mold, and it's all fully cured like this. So you can make, you know, a ton like in a short amount of time, whereas this, you can only make one every couple of days. So there's a trade-off. The other good thing with epoxy resin is that if you don't have a pressure chamber to cast in, epoxy resin tends to, because of the slow curing time, tends to degas, or the bubbles tend to raise up quite easily by themselves without a degassing chamber. So Yeah, that can also give you a better quality cast as well. That's bubble free. But yeah, I mean, either system, polyurethane, epoxy resin, they all work great for small stuff like this. And so that this ultra pore epoxy resin is a 2-to-1 mix. So 2 parts of this to 1 part of this, and you will need a scale, digital scale, to weigh it out, because it's 2-to-1 by weight. Okay, so yeah, always read the instructions of the resin that you're buying. Typically, they come with a fact sheet and stuff like that, and just get familiar with it. Your paper cup. So this is only a small piece, so I'm just using a paper cup, small paper cup. Bear in mind that I will be using a vacuum chamber to degas the resin, and when you use a vacuum chamber to degas, the bubbles will expand, and typically it will about triple in size of whatever volume you've put in here. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to fill up the cup this high and then put it in the vacuum chamber, because then the bubbles will just come out everywhere. So yeah, for this I'll probably fill it up around there, and then that should be plenty of space for the bubbles to come out. So I'll show you my vacuum setup next. But yeah, this is the mold, scale, and I've got some urethane pigment here as well. So I'm going to be pigmenting my clear resin with this stuff, and a little drop goes a long way, so you don't need to use a lot of this stuff. So this is my vacuum chamber and my vacuum pump, and you don't really need this if you are just casting small parts, but this helps to get rid of the bubbles in your silicone and also your resin. So it just gives you a better quality results if you plan to be doing this quite a lot. If you have lots of friends that do molding and casting, then I would probably just hit them up to borrow one of these for a week or so while you're working on your project. Because yeah, it doesn't, there's really no other use for this other than molding and casting. So it takes up space, and you have to spend about $200 for this setup. And I've just got a really flat piece of wood here, and then the important thing to note is that the space where you're going to be putting the mold on should be water level flat. So that's why I've got my water level here, just to make sure that it's nice and water level flat. So when you pour the resin, the top of the resin is going to be nice and flat. Right? You don't want it to be slanting. Just looks weird. And that's also important when you're making the mold as well, is to make sure that whatever surface you've got the mold making box on, it should be water level flat. So something to keep in mind. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to dust my silicone mold with magnesium powder or chalk, or you can use baby powder. So what this does, it gives you a nice matte flat surface to work on after you've casted it. So if you don't dust it, sometimes the resin will, when it cures, it will be really nice and shiny. That might be something that you want, but for this project I need the surface to be matte and rough so I can paint. So a rough surface will take paint a lot better than a glossy shiny one, obviously. So doing this will help matte the surface. I'm going to turn my fan on here. It's going to get a little bit noisy, but all I'm doing is using a makeup brush and just dusting the inside of it, and then so you don't want chunks of chalk in there, you just basically want a nice fine coating of chalk. So that's all good. And what chalking also does is it helps the resin to get sucked into the crevices. That's the theory. I've always done it and it always helped, so I just kept doing it. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is just check that these haven't locked up. Yep. And then it's important to shake the two bottles for about 30 seconds to a minute before using it. Especially if you haven't used these in a while. Give it a good shake. Alright, now I'll switch this on, and I know I've written down on the mold that the part uses around 130 mils of resin, so I'm gonna put the cup on and then tar it, set it to 0. So if it's 130 mils, I will need, how much do I need? Do some math here. There's my phone. So I need to divide 130 by 3. Here's my calculator. I should be able to do this in my head. Okay, so about 45 per part. So 45 times 2 is 90. Okay, so 90 mils of this and 45 of this. So just going to write that down. 90, 45. Scale switched off. Switch it back on again. Set it to 0. Okay. So 90 of this stuff. Alrighty. So 91, 90, it's alright. And then 45 of this stuff, which will total to, we should total to 135. Okay, 136, that's all good. 137, alrighty. So, if you're using polyurethane, you really have to work fast now. Once the two parts come together, it will start curing. So imagine if your polyurethane cures in 15 minutes, you really have to mix this really fast and pour it within 15 minutes, otherwise it's not going to work. But because it's epoxy resin, I can take my time, talk to you guys, mix in my pigment and degas it and blah blah blah, because I have up to 2 hours before I need to pour this. So that's a good thing with epoxy. So all I'm doing, I'm going to take a little bit of the off-white cream pigment, just a tiny little bit, that's too much. This goes a long way. And then just a tiny little bit of red. So I'm going to get like a pinkish color, which is what I want for the skin. Alrighty. And then now we're going to mix. And you really need to give this a good mix. And that's pretty pink. That's alright. It will all be painted at the end of the day, so it doesn't matter. And when you're mixing, you want to make sure you scrape the bottom and the sides. Again, if you're using polyurethane, you really have to be working really fast. So you mix for about 30 seconds before you have to start pouring it. But with epoxy, again, I can take my time. But you really want to give it a good mix. The better you mix it, the quicker it's going to cure, and the better result you're going to get from the cast. So that's all good, that's all mixed up. And then the next thing I'm going to do is get rid of the bubbles that I've just created from mixing using my vacuum chamber. And I'm going to leave these popsicle sticks in the cup because they help to break up the surface tension of the bubbles. Make sure that's all locked. Turn it on. Open the green one, and that's going to start sucking air out. You should see bubbles start coming out. And the pressure gauge will start to decrease until there's almost no air left inside. There you can see the bubbles starting to come out. So what I do, I like to shake it just to help break up the bubbles, because otherwise it just keeps growing and growing and growing. But yeah, it's hard to see over this grubby glass. You see the pressure's almost up to the maximum vacuum now, so that's fine. We'll let that running, and you'll see the bubbles start to come up. Now if you see that it's about to overfill, you can release the vacuum by using this. And with that, we'll just let the air back in and the bubbles will go back down. So that's why you need a bigger cup. Always use a bigger cup then what you're going to be using the volume, because the bubbles will rise. So that's a pretty good tip, is to always use a bigger cup. Yeah, I've already dropped some out, spilled some out already. So you're shaking it, breaks up the bubbles. So I'll keep doing this until the bubbles have settled. Which means there's no more air trapped inside the silicone, the resin. So you can see it's just the small bubbles popping up now, not a big mushroom of it, which is good. And shaking it again just makes the process go a little bit faster. So if you're using polyurethane resin, you probably won't get time to do this, unfortunately. So that's why most people, when they cast with polyurethane, they have a degassing chamber, which is not a pressure chamber, which works faster than a vacuum, and it basically compresses the bubbles so small that you can't see it. And that's another bit of kit I'll probably invest in the future, because it really does help casting in polyurethane when you have to work really fast. But with epoxy, using a vacuum chamber is fine, vacuum pot. So you can see the bubbles are still popping up. So when you're mixing the resin, it does introduce a lot of bubbles into the mix. And you know, these bubbles will show up in the casting if you don't get them out. But you know, if you don't have one of these, not a big deal. You can still get good resin cast out that's bubble free. And I'll show you one of the tricks is just pouring from really high up. And I also do that when I'm casting. Witch's brew. Lots of bubbles. And then slowly let air back in to the mix. You can still see bubbles coming up. It's alright. Because I'm not casting a completely clear resin piece. A little bit of bubbles is fine. What you don't want is bubbles forming on the outside. That's going to be visible. On the inside, that's fine, because it's going to be painted anyway. Alrighty. Okay, so one last check of the mold. Make sure there's no crap in here. And then the other method to pouring is the high pour. And you want to pour the resin from about this high up and not straight into the mold, but on the sides here, and let it naturally sink into the hole, the crevices. Get my aim right. You want to try and pour just all in the one spot and just let it naturally sink into the mold. So I'll stop that for now, and then I'm gonna give the mold a tap just to make sure that all the resin has sunk into the crevices and not trapped any air. And what I can do is just do this, just wedge it a little bit, flex it. It's just all to get the bubbles away and out from the sides. The other thing that you can use is a flame torch, and that will get rid of any surface bubbles that pop up. Alrighty, and then now I can fill the rest of the mold. So you can see a bubbles popped up there. Pop that. Always wonder where that comes from. If there are always any more. Bubbles are your worst enemy. Anyway, let's continue pouring. Excuse me. So you always want to mix more resin than it's required. You don't want to mix not enough, because then you have to mix a second batch, and sometimes you get the color ratio or the mix ratio wrong. So just always mix a little bit more than you actually need. I've got a little bit left in there, but it's almost perfect. And you can start seeing little bubbles popping up there as I tap the sides of the mold. And that's all bubbles sort of trapped inside the resin and stuck on the mold. That's sort of come loose. And if they don't come loose, then you'll see like a little bubble artifact on the final product cast. Again, flame torch. So with epoxy resins, because they take so long to cure, most of the time the bubbles will naturally pop out if you just give the size of the mold a little bit of a tap. You can see more bubbles coming out. So you can get good casts without a vacuum pot, just from, tapping, pouring high up, and then popping the bubbles once they come up to the top. And again, that's why I prefer using epoxy resin, just so I don't have to rush. Hate rushing. But you know, if you're making 100 of these for sale, you don't want to wait 100 days just to make 100, right? So polyurethane is definitely the way to go. You can probably like make like 20 a day, something like that. 10 a day easy. Just pour it, cast it, demold it, all in 1 hour. But that's about it, guys. That's a nice pinky cast. I've got a little bit of resin left, so I think always have spare molds lying around. I'm gonna pour the resin into this mold of little creature that I sculpted. That's what he looks like. The other thing you can do for deeper molds like this is make sure you've got your glove on and then get your fingers in there and just work the resin into the crevices, into the holes. Give it a good massage. And what that will do is that's just going to coat the inside surface with resin, and then so you don't have any bubbles as well. Now obviously wear a pair of gloves, and then if you're using polyurethane resin, it's going to get hot straight away, so bear that in mind. So with epoxy, it'll take about 2 hours before it starts getting hot. Oh, am I gonna have enough? Always tend to not have enough for the last little bit. That's alright. Doesn't matter. See if I can scrape. Got some here. Scrape the last little bit out. Anyway guys, that's the whole resin casting process pretty much explained. It's pretty easy. I am explaining everything in quite a lot of detail. Yeah. Lots of people are doing it, so don't be afraid of trying it yourself. The worst that can happen is, you know, you may lose $30–40 from wasted material if something fails. It's all good, part of the learning experience, right? But epoxies are pretty good and easy to use resin to start off with. And again, the good thing is that you have a lot of time to work with, unlike polyurethane. Alrighty, so gonna let that settle, and in about a day and a half that should be all nice and rock hard, nice pink cast. And I'll come back and just period every hour or so. I'll come back, doesn't matter, just to check it. If there are any bubbles on the surface, I'll just go in with the blowtorch and just pop the bubbles. That's all. And that just means you're not going to get bubbles on the back side of it. At the end of the day, I'll probably be sanding the back anyway, so yeah, doesn't really matter. Alrighty. It's a nice sunny day here in Brisbane, Australia. Thanks for watching, and hope you enjoyed it. With epoxy resins, there is a limit to how thick or how big you can cast with the resin. So typically in the data sheet that comes with these epoxy resins, they will tell you the recommended thickness of the part that you'll be casting. So I think the reason being is that epoxy can get quite hot. So the thicker it is, the hotter the resin's going to get while it's curing. So if it gets to 130 degrees or higher or something, whatever it gets up to, it may damage the mold or start off gassing and stuff like that. So just check that the epoxy resin that you're using is suitable for casting big things if you're planning to make large sculptures with it. But generally speaking, anything, I think, anything up to this volume with epoxy, it's fine. And what you can also do is, if you're in a jam and you only have access to epoxy, is to do multiple pours. So you pour about half, wait overnight, and then pour a second half in. So that way the curing process is staggered and it's not all trying to cure at the same time. That can sometimes leave a little line where the transition happens, but yeah, if you need to pour something huge with epoxy, just keep that in mind that it may not be suitable. Sometimes you can mix slate powder with epoxy, and this is basically just powdered rock. So slate is a rock basically, and it's just powdered rock, and you can use that as a filler. So if you need to cast something big, this is a good option. It can basically reduce the amount of resin you use by about a third. So you don't want to mix over a third of this stuff, otherwise it gets really mushy. But yeah, I mean, that's something to think about, is you can mix slate powder with epoxy as a filler, and that will change the property of the epoxy. That will make it more brittle and more heavy. But if you use up to a third, it's really not going to matter too much, especially if you're casting something that doesn't need to be completely clear. So epoxy resin by itself is completely clear. It's like the best clear resin you can get. People make resin art with it, you see, and it's like perfectly clear, perfectly shiny as well. People also use epoxy resin to varnish their oil paintings. And yeah, I think that's something I want to try in the future as well. That gives a really, really clear, flat, glossy surface. But yeah, just want you to know that if you're planning to make something big, you may need to just stick with polyurethane resin and work really, really fast.